The screen.
Okay, fantastic. So thank you for having me. Again, my name is Josh Frank. I'm an architect, I'm an urban designer, and I'm principal at Wide Open Office. We're a urban design and landscape architecture firm here in Tampa that we started in 2018. So my business partner Brian Cook and I have extensive experience both in public projects, private projects, both here in Tampa and elsewhere around the state, and in some other states as well at previous offices. And like Maya said, I'm a graduate of USF with my master's in architecture and my master's in urban and community design. That's both from the School of Architecture. So I'm going to kind of go through a lot in the next 30 to 45 minutes here. So please bear with me, save your questions to the end. But basically, I'm going to talk about the sort of history of our interstate system here in Tampa, as well as nationally, and then also how it could potentially change moving forward. So some of you may have heard of this project. It was previously called From Bifurcation to Boulevard. I have shortened it since then to Boulevard Tampa. And everything that I have here is available on the website as well. So I like to start off by showing what I call Peak Tampa, which is just north of downtown. You can see sort of the downtown core to the south in the bottom of this image, Ybor City here to the east, and the Hillsborough River. This circle is Armature Works, and then this yellow shape here is a middle school. And the reason I show this is because this is right at about Tampa's peak urban form. It had a high level of density. It had a well-functioning and well-used transit system, and was essentially one of America's pre-war boom towns as a port city. So that school existed quite a long time, and I want to show that as a reference to a decision that was made as part of the Eisenhower administration to expand the interstate system following World War II. Its original intent was to connect cities to one another, and really what ended up happening was the exact opposite. It ended up splitting cities apart. And so that photo of that middle school in that dense urban form is this building here, sort of in the middle of the photo. This is the clearing for I-275 where it meets I-4, also known as Malfunction Junction. And that's Nebraska Avenue on the right. So at the end of everything, and again, this school sort of here in the foreground of this photo, we ended up with this massive infrastructure project that altered the urban landscape in the city of Tampa and the rest of the country ever since. And it's been a problem that we've been dealing with the after effects for quite a long time. And in this photo, for example, there's at least 5 or 6 neighborhoods that are now completely detached from one another, except for maybe 1 or 2 underpasses. And today, that school was acquired as part of a right-of-way acquisition by FDOT. They tore it down and built this bus stop out of the bricks. And so it's kind of emblematic of how we've treated our public realm, our architecture, our cities, in sort of deference to some of these larger infrastructure projects like interstate highways. So I'm going to talk specifically about 275, and I want to sort of go through the history of it and the impacts of it, and then what we can do about it. So the portion that I've sort of analyzed and studied and talked about really starts at the junction at I-75 and touches every transect in the city. So from very environmental lands up in sort of New Tampa, Carrollwood area, through some of our newest suburbs, our middle-aged suburbs, the university area, pretty much straight through what was originally Central Avenue in Tampa. So it was built literally on top of Central. Over the river, through some of our most impoverished neighborhoods, through some of our most vibrant urban neighborhoods, our historic neighborhoods, historic districts, all the way to where it terminates at a junction with I-4. And so really that's sort of the segment that I want to talk about specifically today. But this image is sort of in contrast to where we were in the original image in 1927. So I'll go back for a second. You can see a lot of the lack of building fabric, the lack of roadway grid, and sort of the impacts of maybe some of these really large-scale maneuvers that have to be made to accommodate higher speed vehicles, turn radii, all that sort of thing. So really an impactful project. In about the late 90s, FDOT started to study ways to expand parts of 275. And that project was in the works for quite a long time. In fact, they went forward with segments in West Tampa. So if you're heading towards the airport, you see that wide empty space in between the two lanes. That was done in the late 90s and early 2000s. I-4 to the east was also widened with the sort of big empty space in the middle. The big fountain in Ybor City was constructed. But really, the junction and 275 north towards USF haven't been touched since the 50s. And so in about 2015, FDOT concluded this study that started in the late 90s that said, we need more lanes. And this was what they proposed, essentially doubling and in some places tripling the footprint of I-275 to include what's called variable express rate toll lanes, which means when there's more people on them, it costs more to use them. When there's less people on them, it's cheaper to use them, so to incentivize their use. You've probably seen those if you've driven around in Miami or Fort Lauderdale area. So this was part of a statewide effort, but locally, this was the presentation that was given to expand 275 and the interchange. And this was the final version. So you can see essentially those green lines are the toll lanes, and the widened portions are sort of those yellow and orange general use lanes, with a blue lane in the middle, which was supposed to be high-speed rail at some point. So in 2016, that was presented, and I was still at USF in research at Florida Center for Community Design and Research at the School of Architecture. And we were hired to talk to the community about how we could make this project better. And FDOT really wanted to know, essentially, unfortunately, where do you want palm trees? What can we fix while we're breaking the interstate up? And how can we help people get around during construction? That's all they wanted to know. There was really no genuine effort to discuss the project beyond that, which was really disingenuous and unfortunate in a lot of ways. But it was a great learning experience. And one of the things that I learned and heard from quite a bit in the community was that folks just really didn't want this project in a lot of ways. And so that I was at the final presentation because my boss was sick. And so I gave the presentation to the round table of elected officials, state representatives, you name it. And essentially, FDOT didn't want to do anything the community wanted and only wanted to build the road, basically. And their biggest reason was they didn't want to pay for maintenance, if you can believe that. So that led to a community uprising and a revolt, essentially, amongst activists, city representatives, community groups, myself, and a lot of other folks. And essentially what happened is the FDOT we were able to beat FDOT and push this project off in a lot of ways. And there was a lot of pushback from the state. At the time, Governor Scott had a heavy hand in on this project, and we saw everything from local officials resign to protests and marches against the project, which was called TBX at the time. And like I said, FDOT eventually hit the reset button and said, we're going to rebrand the project as Tampa Bay Next and take a fresh look. And even at the state level, we saw retirements as a result of our sort of being a pain in the side of FDOT. So after the Tampa Bay Next, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Who was that in a picture at the state level?
Paul Steinman.
Okay.
Yeah, Paul Steinman. So there was a big falling out at district level. They brought in new staff and new leadership and rebranded the project. And this was their new lighter version. It was TBX Lite. Still had some of the express toll lanes. Really, the options were down to, do we run it on the north side of the interstate or the south side of the interstate, and which neighborhoods lose the most. We had successfully gotten them to push toll lanes off of 275 between downtown and USF and over to I-75 out in the more rural parts of the county where the impacts were significantly less. but still, nonetheless, it was a massive multi-billion-dollar project. So it was about at that time that I used my thesis for my master's in urban and community design to look at alternatives that I heard from the community, which was essentially what can we do that's not expanding the interstate? And I really had no answer prior to that. It was an open-ended question. And it made a lot of news and made a lot of press. I was in national news and local news and was able to talk to local agencies, MPOs, about the project, and it really did gain a lot of traction. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So I want to get now into a little bit about the reasons why I think the interstate is expendable. And this is maybe that aspirational part of this project is that I think we can do a lot better, and I'll tell you why. So the first thing I'd like to do is talk a bit about what we know the interstate currently does before we talk about what it can do. So the first thing is they were originally built with the intention of being these regional connectors, but really what they ended up doing was accelerating sprawl. And as a result, 275 specifically, as it goes over what was once the center of the city, carries mostly people going 1 or 2 miles. The majority, in fact, 2/3 of the traffic on 275 are between USF and downtown. That's inherently not regional. And before I gave this presentation, city agencies and FDOT had never really looked at these facts and figures, even though they were publicly available. But dramatically, I would say, the majority of people are actually getting on at Hillsborough and getting off at Bush, which is more like a local road than an interstate in design. So again, 2/3 of people using it locally, not regionally. And that's reinforced with exit.
Josh, can you just go back to that graph and explain it a little more?
Sure. So on the right, we've got sort of where the downtown interchange is, and on the left, we've got where the interchange with I-75 is. So this bears to Fletcher, Fletcher to Fowler, Fowler to Bush. Those are the USF exits, and this is towards downtown. So the vast majority of folks in this chart are using it between Fowler and Columbus. And basically that's Tampa Heights, Seminole Heights, East Tampa, VM Ybor, and Old Seminole Heights. And so it's 4 neighborhoods. And most of the time it's people jumping on and off. And because Hillsborough Avenue is one of the biggest east-west corridors in the area, it goes from I-75 all the way to the beaches in Pinellas County, essentially. That is sort of the equator, if so to speak. So most people are actually going towards Hillsborough Ave and either getting on or off at Hillsborough Ave. So those folks that are coming from Pasco County and or are coming from Pinellas County going through, using it as a throughway, is about 1/3. So it's a lot less than the people who are using it. What I would say is maybe an incorrect way to use it, or certainly not designed for that. And that's reinforced by exit data. So another source of data that FDOT had never checked before. This is based off of, actually it came from the bridge data. So the health of all of our exits and bridges is measured every year, and they take a annual traffic count when they take that structural integrity measurement. And so I was able to show just how many folks are coming from downtown to USF and how many people are going from USF to downtown. So in fact, it's pretty overwhelming that the USF exits by direction are where people are going. So it makes the most sense. USF is one of the biggest employers in the county, and we've got a lot of neighborhoods just south of there. And so most people are getting on the interstate to go to USF, and they're getting back on the interstate to go home. And that happens within 5 miles of USF, essentially. So the majority of people aren't coming from Pasco or from downtown. They're coming from 5 minutes away. And that's a big revelation.
Mm-hmm.
So the second reason why I think I-275 is expendable and what it does is because it actually causes congestion. So this is a phenomena or theory that has been proved out over time. It's called induced demand. And for those of you who've seen Field of Dreams, it's essentially if you build it, they will come. So it's a cycle where if you build lanes because an area is congested, people will use them because it's perceived to be quicker and faster. And so more people will use it, those lanes will fill up, and then you're right back where you were before. So we've seen that cycle with 275 at least 2 or 3 times, where we started with 4 lanes, now we're at 6. They wanted to go to 12, and there's really a cost benefit at some point that needs to be discussed about where do we draw the line? How wide is too wide? And there's places like the Houston, Texas, the Katy Freeway that has widened to 24 lanes and filled up and reached its capacity 10 years before they estimated it was going to. So we know that it will fill up and we will have to do it again. The question is it worth it? And at what point do we reassess this as a decision for the city and county? And that's reinforced with that same chart and traffic counts, because Florida Ave, I-275, and Nebraska are parallel and they go to the same places, but 275 has more traffic. And the reason it has more traffic is because A, it's perceived to be faster, and B, it has more lanes. And so really, if they widened Florida and Nebraska, you'd see those numbers go up too. But because they have kept those local and kept 275 wider, that's why the traffic goes there. So that's what induced demand is. The third reason is because it harms neighborhoods. So this gets beyond just looking at the corridor as a traffic mover. There are all kinds of other ancillary impacts. So for example, one of them is, this is the Publix in Seminole Heights. When this area was not interrupted, the grid was not interrupted by the interstate, that was essentially a 5-minute walk to get groceries. And because of the interstate, we have now limited all of our access to groceries and food and pharmacies and other things that we need from a manageable walk to a drive that is now faster. And so that choice is by and large going to be made for those people. It's a much more inhospitable walk than it used to be, in addition to just the sheer geometry of it. But if it's between making a 3-minute drive and a 5 or a 12-minute walk, people are going to drive. And so that compounded over 11 miles makes a big difference. And so I'll talk a little bit more about how we can reverse that, but that's a big impact. You've now added trips to the network in cars when people should or could mostly walk or bike. Another reason is property value and health. So, for example, this is noise pollution. The 2 purplish streaks on the left side are the runways for TIA, and the pink line to the right is 275. They're about the same at certain points. So if you've ever driven on Hillsborough Avenue past the interstate or past the airport just north, you've heard the planes fly over. That level of noise is about the same as it is being within a certain number of feet of the interstate. And that not only has a health impact based off of your quality of sleep and other issues, but also it's inherently hurting property value. I've seen studies say that 10 to 20% loss just because of road noise, and that's not just the interstate. That's any major corridor with traffic above 50,000 cars a day.
Josh, I'll ask a quick question for the sound.
Sure.
The sound maps, are those people go? How do they get that information? Is it like from your cell phone or
no? So this is national data. It's collected via sensors. So I think they go around town similar to how Google does Street View capture and monitor and capture audio levels. So this is a snapshot. It's not always exactly like this because of weather impacts and other things, But when this was measured, this is what it was at. And there's a national map for this data. It's publicly available.
Okay. So
But
those areas that are gray, is it just because they don't have information, or is it just because the sound is not too loud?
I think it's based off of the data measurement. So I don't know what the yellow threshold is for decibels. I cut the key off of this image. I can find it, but whatever that gray area is, just didn't quite meet that threshold. And the biggest driver is obviously the airport, but 275 you can see kind of has a little bit of bleed to the east and west in this area. So I don't know if that doesn't mean that there's no road noise in those gray areas. It's just below whatever the scale of this data is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I'm just wondering because the train line goes through over there, and I know how loud over there. Like,
right. And another key point. That's a great point. The train is not persistent. This is persistent noise, background noise.
Okay.
So 24/7 level hearing the interstate. The train comes by, I think, 3 or 4 times a day. I can hear it from my house, so I know exactly what you're talking about. But
so yeah.
Yes. So that level, that pink level, can be as high as about 80 decibels, which is the equivalent of your dishwasher running in the background all day, every day. For people who live in that sort of yellowy area.
Okay.
And that's about 5,800 homes just within this sort of rectangle here that are impacted by that. So that's 6,000 people, 7,000, 8,000 people. So that's just noise pollution. That's not including air pollution, which with fine air particulates that's just emissions. There's also a lot of studies now talking about disintegrating rubber with tires and how the wear of tread can accumulate and also contribute. If anybody lives within a certain distance of an interstate or the interstate, you will have experienced the black soot that accumulates on your windows and on your porch and pretty much on every exterior surface. I lived in Ybor City for 3 years, and we were just south of I-4. Our porch had black soot on it pretty much weekly, daily. And that is carbon, that's heavy metals, it's cancer causing, carcinogenic. And so that by itself is a major health hazard, to the fact where a lot of areas in Europe are recommending that no homes are zoned or built within 500 feet of major roadways because of this increased risk of asthma, heart disease, other illnesses. But the other part of this in health, in terms of health, is the walkability. So if people are walking less to the grocery store and driving more, they are less active. So we've seen in an aggregate level that people who live within a certain distance of this corridor do suffer higher rates of asthma, cancer, heart disease, all these other things. And so the fourth reason is because it's expensive. This is one of the last slides that FDOT showed to put together that light version, where they were just fixing the interchange a little bit, was still $318 million. And for reference, when I presented this, $318 million for 2 new lanes is about the same as it would cost to add 8 or so miles of streetcar, or half of the cost of the estimated CSX commuter rail corridor. And that's only for 2 lanes over 10 miles. The interstate system is massive and, incurs hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of cost and debt to bond every year. And toll lanes have shown to never make a profit on any of it. They only barely pay for maintenance. And then with all the other detriments to property value, interstates are inherently a net loss. They're never really providing value back to property in a way that's a good return on investment. All of these subjects are a thesis in and of themselves. So I'm just giving you like the quick bullet points. So I apologize if it's a lot, but it's a very dense subject. So I-275 is better as a boulevard. And I wanted to pause before I get into that because this presentation is a little bit old. I have since added a whole other component that I want to talk about because it's super important. I want to talk a little bit about equity in this decision and how we can use the value that we can create in a way to build equity. The interstate was purposefully built in and on top of and through minority communities. This is a map of redlined neighborhoods in Tampa that were purposefully selected to basically tear apart and to build over. And the reason that was a conscious decision is because essentially there was a racist element to the decision that basically said, these are minority neighborhoods that do not have the wherewithal to fight the project. And also, we essentially the people in charge did not want these people of color in the urban core. And so it's a very charged, sort of movement that happened, and I think is one of I've said before, I think the interstate system is probably our largest monument to racism that exists, and is something that is a generational change in how wealth has been built in this country and in this area. So when the interstate was built, homes were taken and destroyed, and that essentially created a generation of people who could not benefit from owning property in the market, and their children could not then borrow money from them to own property themselves. So we are still seeing the sort of ripple effects of this decision now almost 100 years later. And so this is a really key point because obviously the prospering of this corridor needs to include a way to rectify that in a way that not only solves the problem for everybody, but makes amends for what was done on purpose at that point in time. And so this is a series of graphics. I can upload these, but a firm called Kronberg presented these at the ULI, and it was Urban Land Institute, and it was just incredible. The how well things overlaid with one another. But essentially, this is the combination of the redlining neighborhoods, the available housing, and the walkability of those neighborhoods. And so they are still some of our premier neighborhoods, but through gentrification and through the interstate removal potential, these are also areas where we have to do better because there could be a massive amount of displacement. And so we have to pay special attention to that sort of information. I think that was all I wanted to show about that. But so let me skip back to the next steps. Okay, so I've gone over a whole lot, and there's a whole lot more of reasons why the interstate is essentially antiquated and insufficient for what we need it to do. I'm going to go through now what I have pitched and proposed as a solution to accomplish more and be a better project for all of us. So I believe I-275 is better as a boulevard, and the reasons it's better is many. And so this is essentially the key difference. It's 6 lanes elevated today, and in the future is potentially 6 lanes at grade with all the other great things that we can do with it. It's really not that crazy. It's 6 lanes to 6 lanes with more stuff. So the first reason is I-275 is better because the use has changed. We need to design for those 66% of people who are using that corridor locally, because those are the majority of the trips, and they are the easiest ones to shift into a different mode. So this is not a war on people who are driving in this corridor. You can still drive in this corridor, but if we can get a certain percentage of those people into transit on a bike, walking to their destinations via smarter land use, all of these different components, then we can really start to actually solve congestion. As I've said, expanding the interstate and expanding any roadway does not solve congestion. It only adds more cars. So we have reached a point at which we need to start reducing cars. And there are cities like Vancouver, which has set a high goal that said we want half of our population riding their bike to work every day by the year 2030. They have met that and are already working on getting towards 75% of their population. We have seen cities like Paris completely change from a auto-oriented public realm and transportation system to one that is so varied that you can basically choose whichever way you want to get to work or get your groceries, etc. And so we need to start that mindset now, because what we have done and what we're continuing to do is really unsustainable. So this is essentially the ethos of the project, is designed for those people and keep them in mind. So a good comparison is that same 66% of people, which is about 156,000 people a day. That's over 6 miles. That's about the distance between downtown and USF. In Washington, D.C., which is a fairly similar scale city in a lot of ways to Tampa, that same distance, physical distance of 6 miles on a DC red line, carries about 120,000 people a day. So really, it's a matter of what's the best option to carry more people more efficiently. And it is possible to carry more people, even with the growth that we see in population. The second reason it's better is because those regional trips, they are a third of the amount in the corridor. They have a lot of alternatives. Not only do they have 275 now, but they've got I-75, they've got the Veterans Expressway, they've got the Selman Expressway. People like to think we have 275 and I-4. Well, we really have about 6 or 7 different interstates in our area. And one of the, I would say, advantages to potentially taking 75 and sort of saving that as a regional component is that it shares pretty much all the same exits as 275. And so it's redundant. And there's no need, there's a significant less impacts with doing anything on 75, even though I'm not in favor of interstates really to begin with. But if they have to do something, and FDOT is a very big machine, if they do have to expand because of whatever mandate they get from the governor's office, I would argue that letting them do that on I-75 is a better outcome if we can reclaim 275 as part of our infrastructure. And really, the difference in time is negligible. It's a 3-minute conversation. Why would we spend billions of dollars to make 275 3 minutes faster? So the third reason is because development will follow. And a project similar to this in Seattle, where they have since removed this double-decker freeway that you see right here, it's called the Alaskan Way Viaduct. That was reconfigured as a boulevard, and essentially for the past 10 years or so that the project was announced, one property adjacent to it has sold every 11 days. And the total amount of property tax revenue that the city has seen because of this was enough to pay for tearing the interstate down, replacing it with a boulevard and a tunnel, and a new waterfront park with about $3 billion left to spare. So the economic possibilities with converting this to developable land, adding it back to the tax roll, and bringing those depressed property values back up to market is extremely valuable for metropolitan areas that rely mostly on property tax to fund services. And that's without going into creating overlay districts and other things that can value capture and put that back into the community. So this is just straight property tax revenue. There are other ways to even tap into that even more. And so this is an example here in Tampa where this is the Bears Avenue exit, that if essentially right now the interstate is more than just the 6 lanes, it's got the semi-cloverleaf exit that ends up being almost 2 downtown Tampa blocks wide. And so if you think about it on that scale, converting 275 to a boulevard brings about 36 new acres, developable acres, back onto the tax roll, in addition to rising existing property, which is about 3,000 acres worth of existing property that's been depressed. The fourth reason is because it increases that connectivity. So this is basically the opposite of that Publix graphic. Today, you may have 2 exits, one every mile, which is a long walk in Tampa in August with a thunderstorm right behind you. That walk tends to get a little long, and so you're going to drive. If it's a quicker walk where maybe I can get in and out across the street easier, that definitely is an incentive to do that. The other thing is we have more control. So today, if there's an accident on the interstate, it basically shuts the whole system down. If there's an accident on Dale Mabry, it doesn't do that, right? Because we have the ability to close an exit or close a signal and reroute traffic through the grid 1 block around it in any direction. That also, I would say, extends to hurricane evacuations. We're seeing now that best practice today is not to use the interstates to evacuate, because everybody wants to use them, and if there's a breakdown or if somebody runs out of gas or if there's an accident, it's going to really significantly impact the resiliency of our ability to evacuate. And so, utilizing potentially transit, smarter land use as a way to handle evacuations is also something on the table, I think. And at the same time, closing an interstate down and reversing all the lanes to get people to evacuate to Atlanta or wherever is not a great use of resources, because it takes one police officer or one unit at every exit to make sure people don't get on and go the wrong way. So it's a really poor use of our much needed resources elsewhere in the city. Lastly, I think this is last, maybe not. One of the bigger reasons is it actually does solve malfunction junction. So in this scenario, I looked at actually keeping I-275 east-west and I-4 east-west, just as a hypothetical, also because I didn't want to get completely chased out of town. But I think there's an argument for all of these potentially being converted at some point. But if we started with this one, which I think is probably the lowest hanging fruit, one of the benefits is we no longer have malfunction junction, which is the cause of all of the backup pretty much today on the interstate. And FDOT has tried to fix it 3 times, and it's an unsolvable problem. So not having a junction is the only way to solve it. Also, transit will work better. So this is part of the scenario. Obviously, as I've mentioned, this corridor was once the center of the city. And so all of our legacy fabric, our built environment, our buildings, our school system, everything is really oriented towards the center of the city along what was Central Avenue. Replacing that with a transit line only better serves all of those legacy pieces of the city. So everything from Robles Park and areas along Nebraska Avenue and Florida Avenue to Sulphur Springs, the university area. If we ran a transit line down that corridor as well, which I've proposed, it's about 20 stations and could be equivalent to what the DC Metro is running with the Red Line. Plus, it connects to everything else. It connects to Union Station, connects to downtown, the streetcar extension, all of that, Marion Transit Center, Yukon Transit Center, all of that are within walking distance of one another and makes for better transit, not just locally but also regionally.
That on the CSX line?
No, this is in the median of the boulevard.
Okay.
And so that's this in my proposal. This is more of a modern streetcar / light rail component. The CSX line, which is this graphic, is those gray lines, also happens to cross that corridor 3 times. So it's a ready-made transit system that essentially could capture regional and local trips. So the 1/3 folks who use 275 today from Pasco and Pinellas, they also potentially could have an alternative to use transit, and we can reduce that number even further. In fact, I think we have to do that because of the amount of population growth that we're seeing. So, trying to reduce trips is key, and we can do that both locally and regionally. So the last piece, I'm right at the end, trust me, I know I'm at about 45 minutes, is I looked at this sort of hypothetically in a design sense. So I mocked up a handful of station area developments. This one being at the Boulevard and Nebraska, where they meet. This is sort of an ideal space where CSX tracks are to have a park and ride facility, as well as student housing, graduate student housing, and office, because we see a lot of businesses that have been created as part of USF and entrepreneurial programs being siphoned off to Pinellas County, West Shore, some of these other areas. But if we can create density around this transit, it also has a better chance of success. And so just some character renderings of what scale we would expect to see in terms of TOD, transit-oriented development. The Sulphur Springs area, this is one of our most impoverished neighborhoods, and it's been created that way because of the demolition of a lot of other public housing by previous administrations. And so we have an opportunity with this as one of the biggest undeveloped areas in the city to provide affordable housing, to provide community programs, and have some of our folks who haven't seen the benefit of some of this gentrification in these neighborhoods to begin to own their first home or start a business. And so this is really a neighborhood that could be very much about restorative justice in that sense, economic justice. And again, one of the other features I didn't mention is expanding the Sulphur Springs River Tower Park and really creating a great public realm that connects people to the park and the river in a way that's really thoughtful and well designed. There's a sort of third typology that I studied, which is there's a lot of weird leftover parcels that maybe aren't big enough for a building. So what do you do with those as part of DOT's right-of-way? In my plan, I've essentially created block parks and created an extension of the Riverwalk into the urban core as a linear park. And so each block gets its own park that maybe they can program with something. If you and your neighbors really like bocce ball, maybe you get bocce ball in your park. But it uses those leftover fragments that are really undevelopable in a way that still creates value, and uses these weird side alleys that were kind of impromptu, or maybe at one point a legitimate roadway, into more of a neighborhood street with cycle track, protected bike lanes, on-street parking. And those properties, which this bungalow today, I think is on Taliaferro, the interstate is like right here, and there's a wall. And so instead of a wall, you have a park, and now your property is worth 5 times what it was before. And then lastly, the terminus downtown. So in this scenario, the boulevard runs underneath the interstate, splits into 2 one-ways with Pierce and Jackson, which is existing today. And we can see potentially this whole middle area between North Downtown and Encore develop as one of the most transit-rich parts of the city, because you've got Marion Transit Center, the streetcar extension 2 blocks away, the Cass Street cycle track, the CSX lines, and the light rail line in the boulevard, all within 2 or 3 blocks of one another. And so this turns that sort of spaghetti mess leftover downtown exit grid back into developable land, with Oaklawn Cemetery, Perry Harvey Park, and completing Encore as part of an affordable housing project within the city. And that could be very high density level development. And then the last thing I want to show is that's a lot, and it seems very far-fetched, but it's really not. Cities are inherently reinventing themselves constantly, and we have, even in this country, seen interstates be removed and created into some of the most vibrant parts of our urban core as we rethink this infrastructure. So in San Francisco, the Embarcadero Freeway was created and collapsed partially during an earthquake. The city of San Francisco decided to remove it instead of rebuild it. And this is what it looks like today. It's now one of the most visited parts of the city, and has restored the original wharf back to its prominence as the core part of downtown San Francisco. City of Portland had the Tom McCall Freeway running along its riverfront. That was removed and turned into a riverfront park, and is now one of the most active parts of downtown Portland. Seoul, South Korea had the Cheongchung Expressway, which carry about 3 times as many cars as 275 does, and was built as a modeled off of American infrastructure with a second road underneath it. So it's kind of double whammy. And that was removed entirely to create one of the longest and most beautiful linear parks in Asia. And they, in fact, uncovered the river that they had previously covered to build that interstate. And now this is the center of Seoul. So where we're at today with this project is we've won a lot of little battles. Toll lanes are no longer being built on 275. They're being pushed to 75. FDOT is still looking at where to grab property and how many homes they're going to tear down and how they're going to continue to expand the interstate. We also passed a sales tax for transportation, which is massive. We can't just remove the interstate tomorrow. We have to build a system that makes it possible. And so funding is a huge question that hopefully will come through at some point. And FDOT continues to FDOT. They have come up with, these are the latest 4 scenarios for how to fix malfunction junction, none of which is good for anybody. There's winners and losers on both, in all 4 scenarios, which is just horrendous. And it's still part of the work program. But the positive is things are starting to change and people have heard this. It's not just me, it's a large community out there asking for something better. In 2019, this project and myself, we were added to the Congress for New Urbanism's Freeways Without Futures report, along with 10 others. We were peer reviewed, and projects that I've showed you have made this report and graduated because they've been removed. But we've been peer reviewed that says, yeah, not only can this be removed, but it should be removed. And so that's a big deal. This is a national list. And so making that list was really big. And officially now, the Hillsborough MPO has unanimously supported further study funding. And so because of COVID, things have been pushed back quite a bit. So I don't know exactly when that's going to happen. But there is verbiage in our work program that says this needs to be studied further as a community option, which is pretty significant. And so this is a quote from an article, pardon the language, but it basically is saying, you know, the MPO voted unanimously to go ahead with the study, which is, I think, really inspirational because Florida is a weird place. We do horrible things to the natural and built environment, and to do something this progressive and this nuanced, I think, is really worth celebrating. So that's really the meat of the presentation. And Maya, from there, I think we can do all kinds of questions.
Thank you so much, Josh. That was great. So I will open it up for questions. And if you all could, don't mind, you know, turn on your video. Oh, let me do mine too, so that Josh doesn't think he's on here alone.
Yes.
But I'm sure some of you have questions. I know Amanda says that her commute is the downtown to campus part. Hi, Amanda. You have a question?
My mic was off, sorry. Not really. I thank you, first of all, for your presentation. That was amazing. Commuting in Tampa is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Like I said, my commute's actually from south of Gandy to campus, but I don't really count Bayshore as part of my commute because it's like lovely every day. But I guess my question is, I'm also a big advocate of bikes. How would you sell riding your bike as a commuting option in Florida in the summer?
So first, I want to say, you know, thank you for your question. That's it's great to hear, and I'm from Florida, so I get it. I'm St. Pete native. It's hot and muggy and can be not fun, but also I think it's designed that way currently. And some of my favorite places to ride, obviously Bay Shore is one, but there are a lot of neighborhood streets that still have a lot of mature tree canopy and maybe not as much traffic that actually aren't that uncomfortable. So, I would say that it's definitely more of a hardcore person, younger, more active, who's going to be able to ride their bike potentially in Florida. But I do think there are a lot of things we can do to make it better. And one of the things, Maya, we talked about this a little bit before the presentation, but I kind of float in between the three buckets of planning, design, and engineering as an urban designer. And I think sort of all of those disciplines understanding each other a little bit more could really benefit decisions just like that. So understanding that as an engineer, perhaps, or as a civil, that maybe making a little bit of sacrifice in efficiency and not having that big honking inlet in the middle of a cycle track or a middle of a bike lane is not the best idea. Maybe it's worth spending more money and more effort to have 10 smaller ones. Yes, it's less efficient, but it's designed better for people. And so that level of design decision and hierarchy is something that I think you really only get from having maybe a little bit more design experience, because in my profession, we design for people, and the engineering sort of supplements that. And I've seen a lot of instances where it's gone the other way. Things are engineered for stormwater or traffic, and the design part suffers. And so really, that to me is like one of the biggest things we can do, is start to appreciate that a little bit more. And then I think we can make biking better by having wider bike lanes and protected bike lanes and more shade trees and healthier shade trees, which means the planter needs to be wider and soil needs to be better and all these other things that make it work. But until we've reached that point, it's going to be hard, for sure.
Josh, I'm going to ask a question from the engineering side. Let me see
Sure.
how engineer students think. So you're faced with this challenge that it's hot and the roads make it very hot in the summer to ride a bike. Josh is recommending, we can have more shaded trees and so on. Sometimes those may take a long time to grow. So what kind of engineering research would you write a proposal and get funded for to do? Anyone? We always like to make things.
Shade structure.
A shade structure sounds good, but I'm also thinking from a material side. So they'll probably get funding to say do something like some type of light, material that is not does not is cooler, and all sorts of other things that people might come up with to sort of continue with what we have.
I would also, just to sort of add to that, is that I think some of this is a bit about changing culture. And so riding your bike to work, for example, takes in Florida more than most places, takes an employer who's going to maybe be a little bit more understanding and flexible. It says, yeah, it's okay if you don't wear a sports coat to work every day because I know you're riding your bike and it's hot, or is maybe a little bit more flexible with when you can arrive into your office if you're 5 or 10 minutes late because they know you're riding your bike, or they encourage you to do that. That's also, I think, one piece, but also it's systemic in that right now we have a very fragmented bike network, and so having a system that makes that a little bit easier for everybody and not so stressful, or that you're riding really fast, or because if you do ride slower, it is a little bit less hot and a little bit less, you're exerting a little bit less. But definitely having that approach helps. And I know the city is working on it because I'm on a project team that is potentially going to be working on a bike master plan. So
it's also helpful. I've commuted to work for a few jobs that actually had facilities in the office to like wash up.
Yep.
You could ride in whatever clothes and take a shower there, and just get to work really early.
Right.
So that was really helpful.
Yes. And that's where it gets into planning and policy, understanding the design requirements of the people who are using these things, so that maybe you encourage that in the urban core, right? So yeah, again, that's where I'm saying like that cross pollination needs to happen a lot more. Good point.
Madeline has her hand up. Thanks, Madeline.
Yeah, so I actually have a few questions. So thank you so much for the presentation. It was super interesting. I really appreciate it. You mentioned Houston, Texas, and I was just there over the summer. And I was just kind of wondering, they have this like weird like service lanes on the side of the interstates instead of ramps. And I was wondering if like you know why you would have that as opposed to ramps, and how like they impact just communities around them as well, because it makes it like the highway super big. So
yeah. So those are called auxiliary lanes, and in fact, if you ever have been in like Clearwater and seen US 19, FDOT widened US 19 and elevated it and added those auxiliary lanes on both sides. They in fact have those sort of U-turns that go underneath them. Those are called Texas turnarounds because that whole system was built in Texas and invented in Texas. But there's a couple reasons why they do that. One is because there's a perceived benefit of having businesses face those lanes as opposed to ramps. So if you're going to a strip mall that's on there, it's a lot easier for you to engage in business and be a little bit more active in terms of a customer. So if you own a pizza shop, your customers can get to you very easily, whereas a ramp, because of the elevation requirements and the turn radii requirements and sight lines and all that sort of stuff, has to be more highway-like than local road-like. And so in urbanish and suburbanish areas, they tend to do the auxiliary lanes for that reason. And then the second reason is because it's a little bit more nefarious, because it's a lot easier to expand the interstate over surface roads than having to remove all the soil and all the exits and all the stuff. So it's easier for them to put a placeholder with these really simple roads that they can build very quickly and cheaply, to then tear them up again and just keep marching outward. So it's a little bit of right-of-way creep also.
Yeah, I never saw anything like that before. And it was just super interesting too, because it sucked. I mean, like you get off the highway, then you have to like get off like 4 lanes of traffic just
second highway.
Yeah, it's terrible. But yeah, thank you for that. And then my other question was too, I guess I wasn't in Tampa during like the height of COVID, so I was wondering if like the highways and I-275 saw like a decrease in traffic because of people working from home, and if that like has changed like your thought for the project at all.
So it has. I saw some data that's probably not publicly available, but I have seen it, and it was, I think, 50%. So essentially, a corridor that carries 200-some thousand cars a day carried only 100-some thousand cars a day, which is dramatic. That's a going from an interstate to Fowler Avenue level of traffic, right? So it was big, and it has definitely influenced some of my thinking, but it maybe reinforced it more than changed it, because I think one of the biggest impacts we can have to reduce trips is smarter land use and zoning. Because if you take the 15-minute city approach, where I can walk to go get milk or flour, you know, if we're spontaneously making cookies or whatever, and we're out of flour, I can go walk to do that as opposed to driving. So if I can take that trip off by zoning more grocery stores and pharmacies and daily use type establishments, then you can reduce trips that way as well. So and that is nice because it piggybacks off of transit, which if you have a stop, you ideally want a lot of that stuff around that stop to keep that stop active, because a lot of people are going to be using it. And so if anything, seeing people work from home has been reinforcing that idea that we do need more places to go, walk. And I see my neighbors walking out, more than they've ever done it. And it's funny because I see the fact that there's no sidewalks and the lighting is poor and the curbs are really bad. But now they're seeing it too, because they're having a new relationship with their neighborhood, and they're walking more and they're walking their dog and they're being outside a lot and they're talking to their neighbors for once. And they're like, wow, this really is uncomfortable. Like, we should have sidewalks. To me, that's a huge deal to get people to start to see that, just how that impacts their lives.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Adam, you had a question? And then
yeah. Hey, thanks for the presentation.
Sure.
Yeah, so just to play devil's advocate with you a little bit.
I'm used to it. Go for it.
Say I'm like a big state like Florida, and like I want to build an overpass like through your neighborhood. What keeps you from, like, as a house owner, from from me claiming eminent domain, from Florida FDOT claiming eminent domain over your house? I mean, do they like hire engineering or architectural companies or whatever? Like, what grassroots company or what grassroots community organizations like take part in that?
So I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but basically you're right in that FDOT can take it via eminent domain. There's really nothing standing in their way. It's just a legal process. For you as a property owner to sort of stand up to that, there's not a whole lot you can do aside from what I've seen is a Title VI lawsuit. So unfortunately, most of the time that eminent domain is used as a process, and just because of the nature of these interstates and where they've been built, is mostly minority communities. And so if there's a Title VI lawsuit that says this is discriminatory, then that is one way that I have seen eminent domain fought. But it is not an easy process whatsoever. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, kind of. That does from the house owner's perspective, but from the perspective of the community. Like, I mean, you talked a bit earlier in the first part of your presentation about this, and like FDOT had this project and they wanted to push it through. Mm-hmm. And it's like, I mean, like, what happened there that like you guys were actually able to stop them? Was it like protests or?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So yes, it was a lot of protest. It was a lot of community organizations, so civic associations, neighborhood associations, chambers of commerce. But I will say that there's sort of, we could do a whole other lecture or topic on sort of disproving myths, but there's a lot of thought that interstates create value because they move a lot of freight and cars, and that's an economic value. And sound walls are great because they deflect sound, and really none of that is true. And so you see a lot of these grassroots organizations start to step up. And the biggest difference maker was that they were able to band together. FDOT likes to try and split them apart. So it says this neighborhood really wants sound walls, so they'll get sound walls and they won't oppose it. And this neighborhood really wants a park, so we'll build a little park, but we're not going to pay to maintain it, but then they won't, oppose it. And so that's the one side of it. The other side of it is it ended up being, and it typically ends up being, these neighborhood groups that actually are there being impacted, being opposed by special interest groups and, more regional groups and folks from Pinellas and Pasco. So when we were fighting this project, there was a lot of opposition coming from folks from Pinellas and Pasco coming in and say, you can't get rid of this as a regional asset. And it's like, well, it's really easy for you to say you live on Tierra Verde and I live 400 feet from this thing and it's going to give me asthma. So, that has sort of been a constant battle back and forth. So hope that continues to maybe hopefully answer some of it.
Basically, it's like just disorganized, groups or random protests or whatever. The politicians don't really care about that, but it's like when special interest groups get involved, like they start to listen.
A little, but I would say that our public officials do have listened to some extent, even though they've kind of kept it alive when they could have killed it entirely. Because some of what I've found really inspiring is that that one photo that was like, that's me, and I'm drawing in front of the table. One of the people at that table is now a county commissioner. And so to me, that's really inspiring to see somebody who was participating in that project, saw what it was doing, was asking for better, and is now seated at the table making that decision. So it is also part of being active and even running for office if you need to help that process. But I wouldn't say it was unorganized. We had a lot of nonprofits and a lot of 501c3s sort of joining together to try and stop this, and letters from state representatives and federal representatives. So it's unfortunately been a hard fight, but is one that I would say has been really unbelievably successful, because it's not every day. We're the only city and the only region in the state that has fought an interstate off, and that's a big deal. Every other city, Jacksonville, Tallahassee, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, St. Petersburg, Pinellas County, Pasco County, Orlando, they have all let FDOT roll over them with interstates, and we have not. So I think that's a big deal.
All right, thanks.
That is, and it's interesting because USF is 50-something thousand students plus staff, even more, and just we've had nothing like big on, we've had no collective response to what we want, and how do we want to move. And then when you go to the meetings, a lot of the people who are for the project say that they work at USF, right? And so it's sort of, we're not providing people with options.
Well, and one of the things that I've hoped that I've achieved, and I think maybe I have, and one of the things I really wanted to achieve, if anything, was to start the conversation, because it was one that was not happening, and to at least put some sort of vision out there that says this is what we're working towards. Because if we don't have that, FDOT's going to widen it, and then in 10 years they're going to come back and they're going to want to widen it again, and then it's just going to keep repeating because we don't know what we're working towards. And so in my mind, if you have an end zone, then you can start moving towards it. Without that end zone, you're just going to accommodate the easiest solution or the most efficient solution or cheapest solution forever.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think this has been really successful.
For sure. Sophia, you had a question?
Yes, I did. First off, thank you so much, Josh, for the presentation. I thought it was really interesting. I'm sorry I can't turn my video on. My Wi-Fi is really weak where I am.
That's okay.
Okay, perfect. So I'm not quite as familiar with the Tampa area. I actually go to school in the Virgin Islands.
Oh.
But
So
I used to live in South Florida, part of it. So big. Can you hear me?
A little bit.
Okay. Sorry, my Wi-Fi is so weak.
That's okay. If you type your question, I can answer it as well.
Okay, yeah, I can try that as well.
Well,
okay.
we can hear you now.
Oh, okay. All right.
Give it one more shot.
Okay, so I'm not quite as familiar with the Tampa area, but I have lived in South Florida, and there's the big rail system there, but it doesn't seem like it's as utilized as you would expect. So my question for you is, if a rail system was put in Tampa, how would you encourage the usage of it? And then additionally, do you think that you would have a more difficult time getting it approved since COVID?
So the first part is you're speaking about Tri-Rail, and at least I think you're mentioning Tri-Rail.
Yes.
Tri-Rail is interesting because it's my opinion is that sometimes bad transit is not better than no transit, and I think Tri-Rail is a good example of really hopeful transit that maybe didn't have the associated land use and zoning and code that should go with it to encourage use and development over time. But it's a bit of a chicken or egg question, because even cities like DC, when they built the metro, suffered. The metro suffered for 30 years in terms of ridership and and economics, but it did finally start to see development and growth and ridership after about 30 years. So I think part of it is understanding that it does take time to change people's habits and to see an increase in use. So it's not going to be a quick fix, but the other side of it is you have to design it and plan for it to be successful. You can't just kind of put the tracks in and hope for the best, which I think is really what Tri-Rail kind of did to a certain extent. But at the same time, I'm hopeful that in this area, things will be a bit different, because Tampa was a transit city and was built with a streetcar system in the teens and 20s that carried more people then with less population than Hart does today with our current population. So there's nothing unique about our citizens that says they won't ride transit. It's just you have to make it usable and accessible and equitable, and you have to make sure that you support it with appropriate land use and design and comfort and fun and all the other things that make transit work. You can't kind of just put it in place. And I think with COVID, the biggest thing is funding. And I know that the biggest impact right now is going to be the ability to fund some of these planning efforts and public projects to supplement transit. Ultimately, transit is expensive for a lot of reasons, but that type of funding typically is a federal match, so it's not as burdensome on a local government as, say, some of the planning and design and other capital projects that go with it. So those are going to suffer here in the next 5 to 10 years. But other than that, I really don't see much of an impact. I know that some folks, may worry about, disease transmission or viral transmission being in public transit. And I've seen a lot of studies that basically say even in crowded metros and subways and in China and other places have not seen a huge rate of transmission, as long as proper protocols are being followed. So I hope that answers your question.
It did. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So if unless there are any other questions, does anybody else have a question for Josh?
Nope. Doesn't look like it.
So yeah. So I wanted to thank you, Josh, for giving us this presentation today. I'm sure the students enjoyed it. You guys could unmute and do a round of applause. So as I said, it's good to have something that's like inspiring, and I think that's what your presentation presented. That's what yeah, that's what you presented. And the background, I think it was great because they're getting a reality check with like people do this work. We've been reading a lot about it. And so for you to be showing the images of what, downtown look like and stuff like that and Central Avenue, this is stuff that they've been reading. And so it's good to know about, real impacts and people like themselves doing their degrees to try and change things for the better.
And I hope the reading was at least a little bit insightful, because that passage, that part of de Botton's writing, was some of what changed my views and inspired a lot of what I've done, because the value of making things for people and designed, and maybe creating a hierarchy that is less efficient or less maybe more costly is really worth it in a lot of instances. So I hope that the reading was at least inspirational too.
Yes, thank
That was
you.
scanned from my copy with my highlights and notes, so please forgive those.
Stop recording that part. It's so funny, I've been working on this proposal, and